Courage and Devotion by author Bruce Kindig.
My story. Well, I am a retired teacher, and I've taught junior high, high school, and college level. So I've covered quite a bit of the fields of history, as well as some other subjects in social science. You kind of have to be a jack of all trades when you first graduate from college, but eventually you can make your mark in some various fields. And Civil War is one of my favorite fields, and I've done a number of things in regards to that. Let's put it to you this way. I had done a bit of research. Well, I've always done research, but who knows that you're ever going to use it to write a book with, right? And so I had gathered up files from the National Archives, and I went ahead and got my own microfilm reader because I bought the microfilm from the archives. And I'd done a lot of work for some 30 years, reading, putting things into files and organizing, with my goal always to be to someday I'll write the book about a Civil War, Confederate Civil War artillery battery. And I was inspired by a church window. Not that I had seen the church window. I had to take a special trip down to Bolivar, Tennessee to see this window. It was put up in 1867 after the war. But the window was in a memorial to John Marsh. And John Marsh, who was killed in the Battle of Franklin, was the subject of a lot of my research. So I wanted to see this window. Eventually I did. And of course, I put a picture of the window in my book because I don't even know if the people in that congregation actually knew that much about it. It wasn't a very large window. You know, churches often have a lot of stained glass. This was just one smaller one it was actually paid for by the sale of someone's horse, and from that money they had the window put in. So I decided that if I didn't write this book, all of this knowledge that I had gained from all these years of doing research would just be lost. And so I eventually decided to sit down and write it. And a little more involved to write a book than a person might think, but I had lots of information, and I wanted to include as many details as I possibly could. I wanted to tell about the common soldier as well as some of the officers, and I wanted to tell about a Southern battery that didn't have a written history. Now, I had found a history written by Captain Scott in 1885 or something, and it was only 5 pages long. It really didn't do much. He was just basically writing from memory. He even wrote at the end of that little article that it was unfortunate that all of the records had been lost. Well, he'd be surprised to know that a lot of the records were stored in the National Archives, which of course didn't exist back in his day. Only in the 20th century have all of those things been categorized, filed, and so forth. And so I wrote, and that's how we got to where the book is where it is. There's a lot to learn about writing a book. Just because I have all this factual information, you have to put it together. And I mentioned earlier that I had been a teacher. I taught school for 42 years, and I got to be a pretty good storyteller in a lot of my classes. Every day would have probably a short story, and some days a longer story. So I knew how to tell a story. And that helped me because now when you set out an outline so that you could know where you're going next. And as you set up this outline, I begin to tell stories. And so the stories are of battles, of course. You expected that. Stories are of the officers. Well, we kind of know about them. And then there are stories of some of the enlisted men. And one of the things I often said is, why shouldn't we know about B.B. Battle and only about Stonewall Jackson? And that's kind of where I put it. I will tell you about B.B. Battle, and I'll tell you about 24 other common soldiers of the day. What surprised me the most was there's a couple of things I was looking for. One was I was looking for ancestors still living today, and I found some. The other one was that I wanted to find a photograph of Smith P. Bankhead and also of William L. Scott, the two captains. And the interesting thing about the photographs, I don't think they exist, and if they do, they're in private hands. Because I've been through the State Archives of Tennessee and through the newspapers and collections of various libraries. So I kind of have given up on those, but finding these ancestors, one of the things I remember was one lady told me that they had their ancestor's Confederate jacket that he wore during the war. And they said in 1940, they loaned it to somebody to wear in a parade, and they never got it back. And that's too bad. Or more likely, I would go and met a young, or not a young, I was the young man in this case. I met an elderly gentleman in Madison, Wisconsin. I was sitting there in his living room. He knew why I was there. I was there to talk about his Civil War ancestors. And when I told him the names of these Confederate soldiers, he said, I didn't know I had those. He thought I came to talk about his Union ancestors. Turns out he had ancestors on both sides, and he only knew about one. So I pretty much ended up being the guy that explained to him what I knew of his ancestors. Fortunately, he had a cousin that lived somewhere else, and I was able to correspond with that cousin and get photographs of their tombstones and so forth. So that's the surprising things that, you never know what you're going to come up with or not come up with. Still looking for that diary, but there were a lot of soldiers, particularly in this unit, that could not read and write. The handful that could read and write, they had some beautiful prose. Usually they're writing official documents or requests for something, but I've never found any letters home or letters from home, and that's too bad because I'd love to have found that. If you knew that you had an ancestor in this unit, I have documented about 250 people. I have written individual biographies of perhaps 24, and of course I'm mentioning all kinds of things about individuals, who got wounded, where they were wounded, or what type of wound they had, or sickness, were they deserters, all of this kind of thing I have there. If you're looking for genealogy, if you're looking for a history of the Western Theater, that would be mostly the Army of Tennessee. You would follow that through this battery. Politics comes into play, so I have some politics in here. All of the officers apparently owned slaves. Usually they were house slaves. Only found one enlisted man that ever owned a slave, and the others did not own slaves. So we have that aspect. I've checked, if you want an economic, I go through money, how much people made, where they were working, what was everyone's occupation. Now you have to realize these 250 people, I don't always find every occupation, or I don't always find every location of where they were from. But all that I could find in regards to these individuals, the officers, and the unit and where it went, I try to include that in this book. One of the things I found about the modern reader, as opposed to the readers of 50 years ago or so, is that readers now want details. They want those fine little questions answered that I used to ask all the time. It's kind of like when a soldier was on guard duty, is his rifle loaded? Okay, sure it is. Well, when he comes off guard duty, what does he do with it? Does he pull the round? Does he shoot the bullet? Or does he hand his rifle to someone else? Now, most people realize that although guns might be easily swapped amongst the men, usually the one you use, you want to take care of it. So you want to always have your own. So details, one time there was a requisition for 125 canteens. So the question might be, where did a soldier get a canteen? Well, we now know that the government provided them. The officer, usually the not the captain himself, but the first lieutenant, would be in charge of all the requisitions. So I have a lot of information about requisitions. I have a lot of information about some fine details. I tell stories about what people have gone through. We end up with desertions. Why did somebody desert? I know if you're looking up your ancestry, the last thing you want to find out was that he was a deserter and he ran away. You'd rather, I suppose, find out that he was killed rather than deserted. But it is what it is. And history, we're just looking at the facts when we look at that. And I try to weave those facts and those details into the storyline. Myself, I have read hundreds of Civil War books, and I'm always looking at the new stuff that comes out. More stuff is written than I'm able to read. So if you're looking through all kinds of books on the shelf and you come across mine, the point I'm trying to make is this is written for the modern audience, the person, if you really like to know about some in-depth stuff about the Civil War, in particular an artillery battery, down to the privates. This is a story for you. Maybe you even know a genealogy of someone that was in the unit. You also might want to find that out too.
You can purchase this book at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and at the Ewing's Publishing. Available now.